You're calling the wrong frequency. The old janitor's voice was quiet, but it cut through the command center more sharply than the warning tone flashing across every console. Captain Eric Dalton turned from the main display and stared at the white-haired man standing beside a yellow mop bucket, one weathered hand resting on the handle as if he had all the time in the world. Beyond the reinforced windows, rain hammered the flight line at Falcon Ridge Marine Corps Base, blurring the runway lights into pale streaks. Inside, the air smelled of hot circuitry and burnt coffee. A military transport carrying a medical team had vanished from the primary channel 8 minutes earlier, somewhere above the mountains, with a storm front closing around it. Technicians moved between terminals. Headsets crackled. Green lines shivered across black screens and disappeared. Dalton's jaw tightened. "What did you say?" The janitor looked at the frequency display. His name was Thomas Callahan, though almost no one in the room knew it. To them, he was simply the old man who emptied trash cans after midnight and polished the floors before morning inspection. His gray custodial shirt hung loosely from narrow shoulders. A faded leather pouch rested on the lower shelf of his cleaning cart. "They're still transmitting," Thomas said. "But you're listening in the wrong place." Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce stepped between him and the nearest console. At 31, Pierce carried himself with the hard certainty of a Marine who trusted regulations, rank, and locked doors. "This is a secure operations floor," he said. "You do not speak unless someone asks you a question." Thomas did not look at him. He watched the waveform pulse once, vanish, then return as 3 faint marks beneath the static. "That relay is drifting," he said. 3 beats every 12 seconds. "It's pushing their signal below your scan range." A young communications technician, Lance Corporal Daniel Brooks, glanced down at his headset. He had heard something beneath the noise. Not words. A rhythm. 3 soft bursts, almost too weak to notice. Dalton saw the hesitation on Daniel's face and stepped closer to Thomas. "Mr. Callahan, this room is handling an active emergency. You mop floors. My Marines operate the equipment." Thomas finally met his eyes. His own were pale blue, steady beneath heavy brows, carrying none of the panic filling the room. "Then tell them to widen the lower band by 20 kHz. Pierce gave a short laugh. 2 nearby Marines looked away, uncomfortable. Dalton's expression hardened. "That is enough. Sergeant, escort him out." Pierce reached for the cleaning cart. The leather pouch shifted, and something metallic inside struck the frame with a dull click. Thomas's gaze dropped for only a second, but Daniel noticed. So did Dalton. "What's in the bag?" Dalton asked. The warning tone sounded again. On the central screen, a fuel estimate appeared beside the missing aircraft's call number. 6 minutes remained before the computer predicted total signal loss. Thomas looked at the countdown, then toward the sealed steel doors. "You can throw me out," he said. "But in 6 minutes, you'll wish you had listened." 30 minutes earlier, Falcon Ridge had seemed almost peaceful. The storm was still gathering beyond the western ridge, turning the late afternoon sky the color of brushed steel, but inside the operations building, the corridors carried only the low hum of ventilation and the soft squeak of Thomas Callahan's cart wheels. He moved with practiced care, emptying wastebaskets, wiping fingerprints from glass doors, and straightening chairs that young Marines had left crooked after briefings. Most people barely noticed him. Some nodded. A few did not look up at all. Thomas preferred it that way. At 79, he had learned that being unseen could reveal more about people than being recognized. He knew who thanked the cafeteria staff, who held doors for junior personnel, and who became loud when rank gave them an audience. Lance Corporal Daniel Brooks was one of the few who always greeted him. "Evening, Mr. Callahan," Daniel said as Thomas approached the secure communications wing. "Storm is coming in fast." Thomas glanced toward the narrow window at the end of the hall. The first drops had begun to mark the glass. "It has been coming since noon," he replied. Daniel smiled. Weather service only called it 20 minutes ago. Clouds do not need permission to tell the truth. Daniel opened the security door and held it while Thomas guided his cart through. Thomas gave him a quiet nod. His cleaning route allowed him into the outer operations floor but not beyond the red line painted around the command consoles. He never crossed it. He did not need to. Every evening, he paused near the communications bay for a few seconds longer than necessary. The younger Marines assumed he was resting his back. In truth, he was listening. The equipment was newer than anything he had once used, all flat screens, encrypted processors, and automated scanning systems, but radio traffic still had a pulse. Static still rose and fell like weather. Interference still carried patterns. That evening, Thomas heard one that did not belong. 3 faint bursts beneath the routine channel checks. A pause. Then 3 more. His hand tightened slightly around the handle of his mop. On the lower shelf of his cart sat the faded leather pouch he carried only once each year. The edges were cracked. The brass snap had been polished smooth by decades of use. Inside rested an old field radio and a black and white photograph of 6 men standing beside a rescue helicopter under a rain-heavy sky. Thomas had planned to deliver both items to the base historical office before the building closed. It was the anniversary of the night the photograph had been taken, and he had finally decided the radio should no longer remain in the back of his closet. Captain Eric Dalton entered the floor with Staff Sergeant Logan Pierce and 3 visiting officers. Dalton spoke with the polished confidence of a man determined to make every sentence sound like an order. He was explaining the center's secure relay system when Thomas heard the pattern again. 3 beats. 12 seconds. 3 beats. He looked toward Daniel, who was seated at a side console. Your lower relay is drifting, Thomas said softly. Daniel turned. Sir. Before Thomas could answer, Dalton stopped speaking. The visitors turned with him. His eyes moved from Thomas's custodial uniform to the mop in his hand. Is there a problem? Dalton asked. Thomas looked at the waveform flickering across Daniel's screen. There will be, he said, if nobody listens. Captain Dalton let the silence stretch until everyone on the operations floor was looking at Thomas. The visiting officers stood near the main display with polite confusion on their faces, while Staff Sergeant Pierce folded his arms and watched the old man as if he had interrupted a classified briefing on purpose. You believe there will be a problem, Dalton said. His tone was calm, but the calm was sharpened for an audience. Thomas kept his eyes on Daniel's monitor. The faint pattern had disappeared beneath a wash of static, then returned exactly 12 seconds later. 3 soft pulses. Nothing more. The relay timing is slipping, Thomas said. The system is compensating now, but it will not compensate for long. Dalton glanced toward the visitors, then back at Thomas. And you reached that conclusion while cleaning the floor. A few quiet laughs moved across the room. Pierce smiled openly. Daniel did not. He leaned closer to his display and adjusted the audio level in his headset. Beneath the routine checks and digital chatter, he heard something uneven. It was too weak to identify, but it was there. Captain, Daniel said carefully, I may be hearing a secondary pattern. Dalton turned toward him. May be hearing. Daniel straightened in his chair. Yes, sir. It is faint. Then run the standard diagnostic. I already did, sir. The system reports normal operation. Thomas looked at the waveform again. The system is measuring itself. It is not measuring what the storm is doing to the signal. Pierce gave a short, humorless laugh. That is impressive. Maybe we should hand him a headset and let him run the watch. Dalton's mouth tightened into a thin smile. Mr. Callahan, are you assigned to communications? No. Have you been authorized to inspect this equipment? No. Do you hold current clearance for anything displayed in this room? Thomas finally looked at him. No, Dalton spread one hand toward the visiting officers, as though the matter had settled itself. Then perhaps you should focus on the work you are actually employed to do. The words drew another ripple of laughter, softer this time. Thomas did not answer. He placed the mop into its bucket and moved toward his cart. Pierce stepped in front of it. Not so fast. His gaze had dropped to the faded leather pouch resting on the lower shelf. You bring personal equipment onto a secure floor. Thomas's expression changed almost imperceptibly. That bag is mine. Then you will not mind if we inspect it. I would prefer that you did not. Pierce looked at Dalton. The captain gave a single nod. Pierce lifted the pouch before Thomas could stop him. The leather creaked in his hands. He opened the worn brass snap and reached inside. First came the black and white photograph, its corners softened by age. 6 young men stood beside a rescue helicopter, their uniforms dark with rain, their faces exhausted but alive. Pierce glanced at it, then set it aside without interest. The next object was heavier. He pulled out an old field radio, compact and scarred, its metal casing dulled by time. A narrow plate had been fastened along one edge. Pierce wiped his thumb across it and read the engraved words aloud. Raven 6. The name seemed to settle into the room. Thomas's eyes fixed on the radio. Pierce looked around and smirked. What is that supposed to be? Your private call sign. Dalton picked up the photograph and studied it for half a second. Perhaps Mr. Callahan enjoys collecting military souvenirs. Thomas held out his hand. Put the radio back. His voice was still low, but the room seemed to contract around it. Daniel removed one side of his headset. He had never heard Thomas speak that way. Pierce turned the radio over. This thing is older than half the people in here. His finger found the transmission switch. Thomas took one step forward. Do not press that. Pierce looked directly at him, then smiled. Why? Is Raven 6 going to answer? Pierce pressed the switch. The radio answered with 3 dry bursts of static. Then silence. 12 seconds later, the same pattern returned. 3 beats. A pause. 3 beats. The sound was small, almost unimpressive, but it changed Thomas Callahan completely. His hand remained extended, yet the operations floor, the glowing screens, and the rain against the reinforced windows seemed to fall away from him. He was no longer 79 years old. He was 32, standing inside a dim communications shelter while a mountain storm shook the canvas walls and turned every antenna cable into a trembling line. The equipment around him was older, heavier, and less forgiving. Metal switches clicked beneath his fingers. Vacuum-lit dials cast amber light across the faces of exhausted operators. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a reconnaissance team had missed its extraction window. Their primary radio had failed. Their backup transmitter was drifting beneath the assigned band. Everyone else heard only interference. Thomas heard 3 beats every 12 seconds. Raven 6, this is Sparrow 2, a young voice had whispered through the noise. It belonged to Lieutenant Robert Hayes. We have 6 men with us. Visibility is less than 50 yards. The rescue aircraft cannot find the beacon. Thomas had leaned closer to the headset, one hand steady on the tuning wheel. Sparrow 2, hold your position. Raven 6 is listening. Wind pressed rain against the shelter in hard sheets. Officers behind him argued about closing the damaged channel. The unstable signal was pulling power from the network and interfering with higher priority traffic. Thomas understood the order. He also understood what silence would mean to the men waiting in the dark. Major Callahan, the duty colonel had said, shut it down. Thomas had looked at the clock above the console. 12 seconds passed. 3 faint bursts returned. Negative, he replied. Someone is still calling. For hours, he rebuilt the connection one fraction at a time, guiding the rescue crew through shifting terrain while Hayes transmitted in short, disciplined phrases. The young lieutenant never asked whether help was coming. He only reported fuel, weather, and the condition of his men. One voice in the group grew weaker as the night continued. Sergeant Michael Reeves had carried the damaged transmitter across miles of steep ground, keeping it dry beneath his jacket. When the final rescue aircraft reached them near dawn, Reeves was the last man to hand over the radio. He had pressed it into Thomas's hands afterward and managed a tired smile. "Keep it, Raven 6, he had said. "So you remember what it sounds like when nobody quits listening." The memory released Thomas as suddenly as it had taken him. The amber dials vanished. The modern operations floor returned in cold blue light. Pierce was still holding the radio, his thumb resting on the switch. The 3-beat pattern faded into static. Thomas lowered his hand. His face showed no anger, only a weight that made Daniel Brooks sit straighter. "That radio belonged to Sergeant Michael Reeves," Thomas said. "He carried it through a storm so 6 men could come home." Pierce's smirk weakened, but Captain Dalton stepped forward and took control of the moment. "A good story does not grant access to a secure network." Thomas looked at the photograph on the console. "No," he said. "But that signal might." Daniel turned back to his monitor. A new waveform had appeared beneath the standard traffic, faint but regular. 3 pulses. 12 seconds. 3 pulses. The same rhythm was now moving through the base relay system. "Captain," Daniel said, his voice tightening, "the pattern is active on the lower band." Dalton stared at the display. "Run identification." Daniel entered the command. The system searched, paused, and returned a red message. "Archive protocol detected. Authorization required." Pierce looked down at the old radio in his hands. For the first time, he held it carefully. Thomas watched the storm darken beyond the glass. "You should open that file," he said. "Before the weather closes the channel for good." Daniel Brooks tried to open the archive file, but the system rejected his credentials before the progress bar reached 10%. A second message appeared in red, "Command level authorization required." Captain Dalton stepped behind him, his face tightening as the visiting officers watched from across the operations floor. "Use the emergency access key," Dalton ordered. Daniel entered it. The terminal paused, then issued the same refusal. Staff Sergeant Pierce placed the old radio on the console with more care than before, but his discomfort quickly hardened into suspicion. "Captain, we have an unauthorized device transmitting into a secure relay," he said. "We should lock down the room and call base security." Thomas looked toward the central display. The 3-beat pattern continued beneath the digital traffic, weaker now, each pulse thinning beneath the storm. "That is not an unauthorized transmission," he said. "It is an emergency return signal." Dalton turned on him. "You have already admitted that you do not hold current clearance. You brought obsolete communications equipment onto a restricted floor. Now a protected archive has activated. Until we know exactly what you did, you are leaving this building." Daniel removed his headset. "Sir, Mr. Callahan may be right. The timing matches the lower relay drift. Lance Corporal, return to your station." "Yes, sir, but the signal is fading." Dalton stepped closer to Daniel's chair. That was not a request. The room fell quiet except for the rain and the low electronic pulse from the old radio. Thomas picked up the black and white photograph and slipped it back into the leather pouch. His thumb rested briefly over Michael Reeves's face. He had come to Falcon Ridge to surrender a memory, not to defend one. For more than 40 years, the radio had remained wrapped in cloth inside a cedar box. Every year on this date, Thomas had opened the box, checked the batteries, and listened to 3 empty bursts of static. This year, he had decided the burden belonged in a museum. History, he had believed, should outlive the men who carried it. Pierce moved beside him. "Sir, come with me." Thomas closed the pouch. The aircraft on that channel is moving southeast. Daniel looked at the waveform. How can you tell? The signal is stretching. The storm is reflecting it off the ridge. They are being pushed away from the primary corridor. Dalton pointed toward the exit. Enough. Sergeant, remove him. Pierce took Thomas by the arm, not roughly, but firmly enough to make the order public. Another Marine rolled the cleaning cart behind them. Thomas offered no resistance. He walked past the consoles, past the men who had laughed, and past Daniel, whose eyes remained fixed on the shrinking waveform. At the steel doors, Thomas stopped and looked back. Widen the lower band by 20 kHz, he said. Then listen between the third and fourth pulse. Dalton's voice followed him across the room. Get him out. The doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. Pierce guided Thomas into the cold hallway, pushed the cleaning cart after him, and stepped back inside. The steel panels closed between them with a heavy mechanical seal. For 1 second, Thomas stood alone beneath the white corridor lights. Then the building alarms changed tone. Inside the operations center, every primary channel dropped at once. The central display flashed signal lost. Daniel's hands moved across his keyboard. Captain, we have lost the transport completely. Dalton leaned over the console. Switch to satellite. No response. Try the emergency network. It is not locking. A fuel estimate appeared beside the aircraft identifier. 11 minutes. Outside the sealed doors, a speaker mounted near the ceiling crackled. 3 faint pulses passed through it. Thomas lifted his head and listened. 12 seconds later, they came again. He stepped toward the small window in the door. Daniel was staring back at him from the other side. Thomas raised one finger and pointed toward the lower frequency display. Daniel looked at the countdown, then at Captain Dalton. For the first time that evening, following orders felt more dangerous than opening the door. Inside the operations center, Captain Dalton ordered every available system brought online. Satellite relay. Emergency aviation band. Civilian weather frequency. Each attempt returned the same cold answer, no confirmed contact. Rain struck the reinforced windows in hard silver lines, and thunder rolled somewhere beyond the western ridge. On the central display, the transport aircraft remained a gray symbol without a voice. 10 minutes of fuel reserve. Daniel Brooks widened the lower band by 20 kHz, exactly as Thomas had instructed. At first, nothing changed. Static filled his headset, dense and uneven. Then he heard it. 3 pulses. A pause. A fourth sound followed, so faint that it seemed less like a transmission than a breath beneath the storm. Daniel adjusted the filter and isolated the pattern. A narrow strip of data appeared at the bottom of his screen. It was not part of the modern relay architecture. The signal carried an old identification header buried beneath layers of encryption. Captain, I found something, Daniel said. Dalton moved beside him. Is it the aircraft? I do not know, sir. The format is not in our active library. Then convert it. The system will not recognize it. Dalton struck the edge of the console with his palm, not hard, but enough to make the nearby Marines look up. We do not have time for guesses. Daniel opened the archive search window and entered the 3-beat sequence manually. No result. He tried the words engraved on the old radio. Raven 6. The screen paused. A restricted file appeared for less than a second before a security layer covered it. Raven Emergency Relay Protocol. Originator record sealed. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Sir, the pattern has a name. Dalton read the line over his shoulder. His expression remained rigid, but the certainty in his eyes shifted. Open it. It requires command authorization. Use mine. Daniel entered Dalton's credentials. The file rejected them immediately. Access limited to Flag Command or Legacy Originator. Staff Sergeant Pierce stared toward the steel doors. Through the narrow window, Thomas stood beside his cleaning cart beneath the hallway lights, listening to the overhead speaker. He appeared calm, almost detached, but his eyes moved with each pulse. "Captain," Pierce said, "maybe we should bring him back in." Dalton looked at him sharply. "5 minutes ago, you wanted him removed." Pierce glanced at the old radio resting on the console. "5 minutes ago, I thought it was a souvenir." Another alarm sounded. 9 minutes of fuel reserve. A technician at the aviation desk called out that the storm had shifted southeast, directly across the transport's projected route. Dalton turned toward the main screen, weighing the sealed file against the man he had just dismissed. Pride held him silent for 1 second too long. Daniel rose from his chair. "Sir, Mr. Callahan predicted the relay drift before the system detected it. He identified the direction of the aircraft from the signal stretch. The protocol carries the same name marked on his radio." Dalton faced him. "Sit down, Lance Corporal." Daniel did not move. His voice remained respectful, but it no longer trembled. "Sir, people are waiting for us to hear them." The words passed through the room and settled heavily. Outside, Thomas saw Daniel turn toward the door. Pierce took 1 step closer to the release panel, then stopped, waiting for an order that did not come. 8 minutes remained. The speaker in the hallway crackled again. 3 pulses. A pause. This time, beneath the static, Thomas heard the broken edge of a human voice. He leaned toward the door and spoke through the glass. "They are still there." Daniel could not hear the words, but he understood them. He reached for the security control. Dalton's voice cut across the room. "Lance Corporal, do not open that door." Daniel looked at the fuel countdown, then at Thomas standing alone on the other side. His hand closed around the release switch. "Respectfully, sir," he said, "that may be the only order here that costs us the aircraft." Daniel pulled the release switch. The steel doors separated with a deep mechanical hiss, and the sound carried across the operation center like a decision nobody could take back. Thomas stood in the hallway beside his cleaning cart, rainwater reflected in the narrow window behind him. For a moment, no one spoke. Captain Dalton's face hardened. "Lance Corporal Brooks, step away from that panel." Daniel kept his hand on the control. "Yes, sir." He stepped aside, but the door remained open. Thomas looked past Dalton toward the central display. 7 minutes of fuel reserve. "How many people are aboard?" he asked. Daniel answered before anyone else could stop him. "For flight crew, 8 medical personnel, and 2 patients." Thomas nodded once. "What altitude did they report before contact dropped?" 9,400 feet. "Wind direction?" "West-southwest at 40 miles per hour, gusting higher near the ridge." Thomas pushed his cart against the wall and entered the room. Staff Sergeant Pierce moved to block him, then hesitated. The old man did not challenge him. He simply waited. Pierce lowered his arm. Dalton stepped between Thomas and the consoles. "You are not authorized to touch this equipment." "Then you operate it," Thomas said. "I will tell you where to listen." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "And when this fails?" Thomas looked at the fuel estimate. "Then you can blame the janitor after the aircraft is safe." The words landed without anger, which made them heavier. Daniel returned to his station and placed one side of the headset over Thomas's ear. The modern earpiece looked strangely small against his white hair. Static filled the channel. Thomas closed his eyes. He did not watch the screens. He listened to the spaces between the noise. 3 pulses came through. 12 seconds. 3 more. Then a broken syllable stretched beneath the storm. "They are transmitting on a reflected sideband," Thomas said. Your scanner keeps correcting away from it. Daniel opened the manual controls. What setting? Disable automatic tracking. Dalton shook his head. That will blind the emergency receiver. For 8 seconds, Thomas replied. After that, you will hear them. Daniel looked to Dalton. The captain said nothing. 6 minutes remained. Daniel disabled the automatic system. The waveform vanished. Every monitor on the lower relay went dark. Pierce inhaled sharply. 1 second. 2. 3. Thomas's hand hovered above the tuning dial but did not touch it. Move down 12 kHz, he said. Daniel adjusted the setting. Hold. Static thickened. Now 4 more. Daniel turned the control. A human voice broke through for less than half a second, distorted but unmistakable. The room froze. Again, Thomas said. Daniel repeated the adjustment. This time the voice lasted longer. Falcon Ridge, this is Mercy Transport 7. We are receiving intermittent signal. Navigation relay unavailable. Fuel critical. A wave of relief moved across the room, but Thomas did not react. Do not answer on the primary channel, he said. The storm will scatter it. Dalton stared at him. What do we use? Thomas pointed toward the restricted archive message. Open the Raven protocol. We cannot. You can if the originator is present. Daniel looked from the screen to Thomas. The security prompt still read flag command or legacy originator. Beneath it waited an empty identity field. Mr. Callahan, Daniel said quietly, what should I enter? Thomas looked at the old field radio resting on the console. The engraved plate caught the blue light from the monitors. For decades, the name had belonged to a night he rarely discussed and to men whose voices he still remembered. 5 minutes remained. He rested 2 fingers on the worn metal casing. Enter Thomas Michael Callahan, he said. Daniel typed the name. A second field appeared. Legacy command designation. Thomas drew a slow breath. Around him, every Marine had gone silent. Raven 6, he said. Daniel entered the words and pressed confirm. For 1 suspended second, nothing happened. Then every secure monitor on the operations floor changed at once. The screens turned black for half a second, then came alive in deep red and amber. A tone sounded from every secure console, lower and more solemn than the standard alarms. Across the main display, a single line appeared, Legacy Command Identity Confirmed. A second line followed beneath it, Raven 6 Authenticated. The room went silent. Even the storm seemed farther away. Captain Dalton stared at the message as if the system had spoken in a language he did not understand. Staff Sergeant Pierce looked at Thomas, then at the old radio on the console. Daniel did not move. His hands rested above the keyboard, waiting. A secure channel opened automatically, bypassing every failed relay. The speakers filled with static, then a weak voice emerged. Falcon Ridge, this is Mercy Transport 7. We have partial control and limited navigation. Request immediate guidance. Thomas stepped closer to the microphone. The blue light from the monitors cut across the lines in his face. He did not look proud. He looked focused. Mercy Transport 7, this is Raven 6. Confirm present heading. The pilot answered through heavy interference. Heading 135. Altitude 8,900 feet. Fuel reserve approximately 4 minutes. Thomas studied the weather map. The storm cell had moved across the primary approach corridor, forcing the aircraft toward a narrow valley east of the ridge. Turn left to heading 098, he said. Descend to 7,200 feet. Hold that altitude until you clear the second ridge. Dalton leaned toward Daniel. That route is not on the current emergency chart. Thomas heard him. It was removed when the new relay towers went online. Then how do you know it is clear? Dalton asked. Thomas kept his eyes on the signal trace. Because the old beacon is still there. Daniel searched the database. A faded navigation marker appeared beneath several newer layers. He is right, sir, Daniel said. Beacon Gray 7. It is inactive. Not inactive, Thomas replied. Sleeping. He reached toward the manual control, then stopped short of touching it. Bring the lower transmitter to 41.7 MHz. Reduce power by 20%. Daniel followed the instructions. 3 pulses moved across the screen. The old field radio answered with the same rhythm. Somewhere beyond the storm, the forgotten beacon responded. A green point appeared east of the ridge. Mercy Transport 7, lock onto Gray 7, Thomas said. Seconds passed. The fuel estimate dropped to 3 minutes. Then the pilot's voice returned, clearer than before. Raven 6, beacon acquired. We have the valley. A breath seemed to leave the entire room at once. Thomas guided the aircraft through each turn, his instructions short and exact. No wasted words. No hesitation. When the transport cleared the ridge, the base radar recovered its position. The gray symbol on the central display turned green. Falcon Ridge in sight, the pilot reported. Beginning final approach. Only then did Thomas remove the headset. Behind him, a separate alert had appeared on the command network. The authentication of Raven 6 had triggered a priority notice far beyond Falcon Ridge. At Regional Command, Colonel William Mercer saw the call sign and rose so quickly that his chair rolled backward. He opened a secure line to Lieutenant General Robert Hayes, who was traveling aboard a command helicopter 40 miles north of the base. General, Mercer said, a legacy identity has just activated at Falcon Ridge. Hayes glanced at the screen. Which identity? Mercer hesitated, almost unwilling to trust the words. Raven 6. The general's expression changed. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he requested the audio. Thomas's voice came through the cabin speaker, calm beneath the static. Hold your altitude. The valley will open in 30 seconds. Hayes closed his eyes. He had not heard that voice in more than 4 decades, but he recognized it before the sentence ended. Change course, he ordered the pilot. Take us to Falcon Ridge. Mercy Transport 7 touched down through the rain with less than 2 minutes of reserve fuel remaining. Its landing lights swept across the soaked runway, then slowed as the aircraft rolled toward the medical apron. Inside the operations center, no one cheered. The relief was too deep for noise. Daniel Brooks watched the green symbol settle on the display, then turned toward Thomas. The old man had already removed the headset. He placed it beside the keyboard with the same care he used when setting down a glass after polishing it. Captain Dalton stood several feet away, his authority suddenly stripped of its certainty. Staff Sergeant Pierce stared at the field radio as though it had become heavier than metal. Mr. Callahan, Dalton began, but the words failed him. Thomas closed the leather pouch and returned the photograph to its place. The aircraft is safe, he said. That is what matters. A new sound rose beyond the reinforced windows. At first, it blended with the storm, but then the deep rhythm of rotor blades pressed through the glass. Marines across the room turned toward the flight line. A command helicopter descended through the low clouds, its lights cutting white paths through the rain. Dalton looked at the identification feed and went still. Lieutenant General Hayes, Daniel said. The helicopter landed less than 100 yards from the operations building. Within minutes, the secure doors opened and Robert Hayes entered with 2 senior officers behind him. At 63, the general carried the quiet gravity of a man who never needed to announce his rank. Water darkened the shoulders of his uniform. Every Marine in the room rose to attention. Thomas remained beside his cleaning cart. Hayes stopped just inside the doorway and searched the faces before him. His gaze passed over Dalton, Pierce, and the visiting officers. Then he saw Thomas. For a moment, the general was no longer the commander of Falcon Ridge. He was the young lieutenant in a mountain storm, listening to one steady voice refuse to leave him behind. Hayes walked across the room without speaking. Thomas watched him approach, his expression calm, though something softened in his eyes. The general stopped 3 feet away. Then, before every Marine on the operations floor, Lieutenant General Robert Hayes raised his hand and saluted the old janitor. The room became completely still. Thomas slowly straightened. Age had rounded his shoulders, but the movement carried the memory of a uniform no one there had seen. He returned the salute. Hayes lowered his hand. "Major Callahan," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "the last time I heard Raven 6 on a secure channel, I was waiting in a storm and wondering whether anyone still knew where we were." Thomas looked toward the rain-covered windows. "You kept transmitting. Because you kept answering." Hayes turned toward the room. "This man designed the emergency relay protocol that brought dozens of service members home when every modern system available at the time had failed. He held one damaged channel open for 11 hours after being ordered to close it. I was one of the men on the other end." Pierce lowered his eyes. Dalton stepped forward. "General, I take full responsibility. I had Mr. Callahan removed from the operations floor." Hayes studied him, but Thomas spoke first. "Captain Dalton was protecting a secure facility." Dalton looked at him in surprise. Thomas continued, "He was wrong to stop listening. That is not the same as being beyond correction." The general gave a small nod. No public punishment followed. None was needed. Dalton faced Thomas. "Sir, I am sorry." Thomas placed the old radio in Daniel's hands. "Remember what opened the door tonight," he said. Daniel looked down at the engraved name. "The call sign?" "No," Thomas replied. "Listening." Weeks later, the radio stood inside a glass case near the entrance to the communications wing. Beneath it, a simple plaque carried one sentence: "He never left the channel while someone was still calling." Respect does not always arrive with rank, ribbons, or applause. Sometimes it enters quietly, pushing a mop, waiting for someone wise enough to hear it.